Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Chris Direwalt.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
Welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And Eliana Johnson, there's no easy way to go about it. This has been when the news is big and the news is emotionally charged, as it has been with the terrorist attack against Israel, in the news business, it produces some special challenges. And my thoughts have been very much with you because I know that these are things that are important to you, as they should be to every American, but particularly for Jewish Americans, particularly for people who have been to Israel, for particularly people who have friends there. And so my thoughts and prayers have been very much with you this week, and I'm very happy to be with you.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I thought we would do things a little differently this week in that the outbreak of this war on Saturday morning, I just felt, and I have been feeling since then, I found myself just turning to the news constantly. Right. And there's been so much good reporting. That it's been fun to be in the news media and use the news media in this way, and so much good reporting from so many different sources that I thought we would start by highlighting that, which is not usually what we do.
Not usually.
And so in some ways, it's I think it's great to do this. The other interesting, I think, aspect of this is that when Hamas went into Israel, they weren't trying to hide what they were doing in the ways that there are sort of parallels. You know, Germans in the Holocaust very much tried to hide. They were not bringing cameras into concentration camps, and there were American soldiers, when they came in, they sort of forced German civilians to look at these things. But Hamas was intentionally videotaping and broadcasting these things. And so the way the news media has chosen to use or not use these horrific, some of the images are horrific but not gruesome. Some of them are horrific and gruesome.
Yeah.
But they wanted the world to see this. And so I think it's interesting to talk about how the news media has chosen to use or not use that. And
as a general precept, when you have a story like this that shows you what the news is for, right? You have a breaking story, you have a developing story, you have a huge story, and it's happening halfway across the world. This is when expert reporting, this is where having the resources and having the ability to cover these things with open eyes is really valuable. And I think it's good to start on some of the good because there's been a lot of really good coverage. One of the outlets that I wanted to highlight, and starting first, is Tablet, which is not a mainstream outlet, but intentionally covers Jewish and Jewish news and Jewish American culture. And Liel Leibovitz at Tablet has had some wonderful pieces. The first, which we're going to link, is headlined Eyewitness account of the rave massacre, and it's actually just several eyewitness accounts. And Liel writes, and this is from Sunday evening, I've spent the last 12 hours speaking to Israelis who were at the Supernova Music Festival. Their testimonies, as you would imagine, are very emotional. At least one broke down mid-conversation and wasn't able to continue his recollection. But the piece, which we will link, is an account of his conversations with these people. And he writes, this is one person's recollection. Some of the Lucky Brands
ones ran to a nearby wadi, seeking shelter amid the shrubbery. I felt like they were shooting right above our heads, one survivor recalled. I dove into a bush. It felt like the shooting was coming from 180 degrees all around us. I understood we're going to be there for at least a couple of hours, and I had nothing on me, and I was like, the only thing I want is a weapon. I want something to protect us. Eventually, he and his friends, some of them barefoot, decided to risk it and try to reach safety, walking close enough to the road to see it, but not so close so that they might be seen. I said, if we see like army or police cars, we're going to the road. Otherwise, we're going to stay away. When we saw police and army cars, we knew that it's a safe place. And there's several more accounts like this, definitely worth reading. And the other question I think that immediately came to mind, at least for me, but everybody was asking it, was Israel's supposed to have a vaunted intelligence service. And I highly recommend, I want to get the title of this book, which I have read, Rise and Kill First by Ronan Bergman is a history of the Mossad, which is wonderful. And Ronan Bergman is at the New York Times, and we're going to talk about one of his stories. But how did this happen, and how did Israel not know this was coming? And there was a great Reuters story, how Hamas duped Israel as it planned devastating attack. And it talks about the Hamas preparations for this right in Israel's backyard. And Reuters reports, in one of the most striking elements of their preparations, Hamas constructed a mock Israeli settlement in Gaza where they practiced a military landing and trained to storm it. A source close to Hamas said, adding they even made videos of the maneuvers. Israel surely saw them, but they were convinced that Hamas wasn't keen on getting into a confrontation, the source said. Meanwhile, Hamas sought to convince Israel it cared more about ensuring that workers in Gaza, a narrow strip of land with more than 2 million residents, had access to jobs across the border and had no interest in starting a new war. Hamas was able to build a whole image that it was not ready for a military adventure against Israel, the source said. And there are a couple of more pieces on this.
And the Times had a good one.
The Times had a great one. The Journal writes, Israel was prepared for a different war, and that piece is about Israel's pivot to high-tech warfare, and we've seen them use that in Iran, where they were doing hacking campaigns. Their special forces are very, very good. So the Journal writes, the military had invested in intelligence, cyber, and defensive capabilities to deal with the threat from Hezbollah and Hamas and blunt the risks of a growing missile arsenal in Iran. It deployed Iron Dome in 2011, which targets short-range rockets, and invested in developing other systems to tackle long-range missiles, and had come to believe that the main threats to security were not essentially extremely low-tech ground invasions like the ones the country saw in the 1970s. The other interesting piece, this is also from Tablet, is by the historian Edward Luttwak, who had a piece in Tablet about the intelligence failure, just titled Israel's Intelligence Failure. And he talks about the role of the Hamas workers in Israel. And he says, Luttwak, who's advised many world leaders and has a very colorful history, at times it's a little bit difficult to know what's true and what's not, but has written many, many books and is a colorful guy. He argues in this piece, in reality, there's only one way Hamas could have pulled off Saturday's massive surprise: by feeding valuable, indeed actionable information to individuals who were Israeli intelligence sources, even though that information allowed the Israelis to destroy rockets before they could be launched against them and achieve other successes. Because the destroyed rockets belong to Islamic Jihad, which is the chief competitor for Hamas and Shia leaning to boot, Iran pays the bills. Hamas itself paid no price to thus fill the espionage horizon below which yesterday's attacks were planned. There are techniques that with much skill and patience can uncover double agents, but no tricks can detect agents who are reporting as best they can what they actually know, and who report enough good intelligence to keep everybody too busy to look for what they do not know. Evidently, years of war with Israel and its intelligence service have taught Hamas how to fight them effectively. Caught by surprise because of errors that allowed Hamas to take the initiative, it is now Israel's turn to act, and not just by bombing Hamas headquarters. A new approach altogether is needed with nothing off the table. And that, we don't know if it's true, but I thought it was a very interesting theory.
Well, and I also think the Tom Friedmanification of the way we think about international affairs and global threats. So if what people want James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. So the premise that was put forward for a long time was that the economic suffering of the Palestinian people was the problem, and that if that could be rectified, then the conflict between the two groups could be minimized. And I think not just the rest of the world, but obviously the Israeli government leaned into this idea. We've got to create a pathway to economic viability for these people. And in the end, the leadership, the Hamas leadership, was using that as a tool to attack the people that they see as their tormentors or oppressors. And we saw it with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. We've seen it with Iran many, many, many times, is that Western nations make assumptions about what motivates political leadership and how these places are supposed to work. And that creates a weakness for us in terms of how prepared we can be when it comes to these threats.
That's absolutely true. And one advantage is not the right word, but one aspect of this conflict, I think, is that Israel did believe, like, our problems are in the north. They're not going to come from Gaza, but they were acutely aware that this threat was ideological, that these people, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran, are ideologically motivated to wipe them off the map, and that there isn't like an economic chip you can give them. Or, I mean, they gave Gaza to, they yanked their people kicking and screaming out of Gaza in 2005, and that did not placate or solve this problem. But I think they did believe that the main threat is not going to come from Gaza. We've pacified it enough, and that we just, they told themselves, we just have to mow the grass every so often. Like, they're going to fire rockets and we're going to go mow the grass every so often. Now, it's pretty clear they have to completely rip up the turf. But what I think this does reinforce for some Americans, a lot of Americans, is the ideological nature of this conflict, which I think a lot of people had talked themselves into if the Israelis could just get to the negotiating table.
I think that the media narrative of the past decade has increasingly moved toward the idea of Israel, the oppressor state, and these put upon people in their suffering may make mistakes from time to time, but this is a human rights cause. And that narrative had really gained traction over time, especially as the partisan divide on support for Israel shifted and changed. And it became the Republicans that were pro-Israel dominantly, and that Netanyahu became a figure of a sort of the Trumpian right. And as the AIPAC energy and the domestic political alignment on this issue changed, that also was reflected in the coverage, because there was a domestic political bias that was reinforcing the international political bias, which is typically strongly anti-Israel, right? So there's a UN international energy against Israel. And in the United States, support for Israel had been fairly bipartisan over time, right? Support for the Israelis had been strong among Democrats, particularly because Jewish voters were typically Democratic, but Republicans basically were on the same team. as that has shifted and Republicans have come to almost universally, we'll get to some of that in a minute, as Republicans have come to almost universally support it, and Democrats, driven by the BLM movement and lots of pressure groups on
there are
campus.
real horseshoe politics here, where the far left and the far right are both they're of a piece on this issue.
Yes.
And we are seeing that play out. Yeah, as you said, we're going to get to it. But I do think that I've been surprised. I mean, I watched the CNN segment last night, and you would have thought you were watching like right-wing television.
It's so
Their
it's so
characterization of the conflict of Hamas, of the atrocities, and I do have some criticisms of it, but I was shocked.
When it's this bad, right? When it's this effulgent, there have been a lot of comparisons about 9/11 and how this is like 9/11. I think the media comparison to 9/11 is this. When it's this bad, right? So when you're talking about, as you said, mowing the grass, and there's rockets, and then there's counteroffensive, and there's back and forth, it's easy. Moral equivalency is easy to come by. But when somebody does something this intentionally, and as you say, advertising doing something so intentionally inhumane, so monstrous, so evil, it shuts the mouths of many of the people who want to equivocate, and many of the people who want to find that space. And in that way, Israel, there was a brief media, and we're going to talk about these things, but there was a brief moment you could feel at the beginning where the left, or that part of the horseshoe, was pre-butting Israel, basically, right? Well, we know there's going to be an overreaction here. We know there's going to be an overreaction here, so we've got to get in there. And when that effort was mounted in the American press, they did it too soon, and as more horrific images and more horrific stories. And very significantly here, there are American hostages, right?
There are American hostages and American dead.
Well, there are definitely American dead, and there are American hostages. And when for Americans of...
And I just saw as we were going, as we were starting to record, it does look like U.S. Special Forces are flying out there to try and rescue these American hostages.
There is no appetite in the United States for anybody taking any Americans hostage, and especially when you have a bunch of craven murderers and terrorists doing it. There's absolutely not. And those folks who tried to pre-butt Israel badly miscalculated.
Just to be specific, the Daily Mail is reporting that the U.S. has put special forces on alert to help Israeli forces locate American hostage, as hundreds of IDF reservists arrive at JFK to answer Israel's call to fight. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Iranian role, which we're hearing all sorts of different things about. The Wall Street Journal on Sunday evening had a piece. Iran helped plot attack on Israel over several weeks. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps gave the final go-ahead last Monday in Beirut, and the Journal, with 3 reporters and a Dubai byline, writes that Iranian officials met with Hamas officials over a series of a number of times in Beirut to help plan and greenlight this attack. When I read this, I thought this is a huge problem for the Biden administration, which just unfroze the $6 billion to Iran.
Right.
And even over the weekend, they were completely invested in saying not a dollar of this money has been spent, which is true. At the same time, of course, Iran knows the money is coming, and it freed them up to do other things with it. And the Biden administration has loosened oil sanctions on them. They've been able to spend more money and do more things since Biden came into office. The source for the Journal article is several Hamas operatives. That's who they cite. And then the Times this morning, right before we went to record, has a piece. Early intelligence shows Iranian leaders surprised by Hamas attack. U.S. says the information has fueled doubts in the United States that Iran, a longtime supporter of the Palestinian militant group, played a direct role in the assault. And three American-based reporters write, the United States has collected multiple pieces of intelligence that show that key Iranian leaders were surprised by the Hamas attack in Israel, information that has fueled U.S. doubts that Iran played a direct role in planning the assault, according to several American officials. These key Iranian officials did not know the attack was coming, according to the intelligence. And I basically just wanted to mark these two pieces so that we can come back to them, because I suspect we're going to learn a lot more about this in the coming weeks. And what we do know, based on the surprise nature of the attacks over the weekend, was that American intelligence did not know it was coming, and Israeli intelligence did not know it was coming, which to me makes it a little bit risky to rely on American intelligence for these stories. It did raise some questions in my mind, so I just wanted to bookmark these pieces and come back to them.
I didn't really understand the point of the story, of the Times story, because I'm sure there are people inside the Iranian government who were surprised by this.
Same. I had the exact same thought.
I'm sure that there were, just as I'm sure there were people inside the Japanese government who were surprised by Pearl Harbor, because when you're doing something like this, you don't hold all staff meetings. You don't send an all staff email to talk about it. And it goes on to say that, so basically you have this, some Iranian officials were surprised by this. And then it goes on, and it's basically a defense of the Biden administration.
Well, that was the purpose of the piece, okay?
Right.
I'm sure the intelligence officials they were talking to, and we know from the past 10 years that these guys are not politically, well, I'm going to take a gander. They're not politically neutral people. But at the same time, giving these guys the benefit of the doubt, I wanted to bookmark these and see how these stories age.
Former President Donald J. Trump and other Republicans tried to cast blame on Mr. Biden. I think they succeeded in casting it. They cast it.
Yeah, this is a problem.
On Mr. Biden, saying that those funds helped to finance the assault. But that $6 billion is not U.S. taxpayer money. Oh. As Mr. Trump and others falsely noted, Donald Trump lied? What? I don't buy it. Nor is there evidence that the money, which officials have said is subject to Treasury Department oversight, was used to finance the attacks. And this felt like beat sweetening for Jake Sullivan, a chance to for the administration to say, "Oh, we know it's Iran, but it definitely wasn't this money."
That they were totally unified and on message, saying that over the weekend.
Yes.
I did want to highlight a couple of pieces I thought were remarkably bad, a couple of pieces and some coverage that I thought was remarkably bad. And there's been so much good stuff coming out. But the head of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, had an interesting moment on MSNBC.
And I flag this because you in the past have had some criticism of the ADL and
Yes.
Greenblatt.
Definitely have had criticism. He's too soft for my liking. But he, and by the way, I would have gone beyond this criticism, which I'll mention. But Greenblatt tore into MSNBC when he was on Morning Joe, and let's play that clip.
I love this show, and I love this network. But I've got to ask, who is writing the scripts? Hamas?
Boy, they wish that those same Israelis who were out there protesting the so-called judicial reforms would be protesting Israel's inhumane treatment of the Palestinians who live under Israeli occupation. But that's just not something that's happening.
It's basically like living, Alex, in an open-air prison.
You have people in there and innocent bystanders that'll be involved in it, but at the same time, it's like, what other choice did they have?
The people who did this, they are not fighters, Jonathan.
260 people were killed Saturday by Hamas fighters.
We're Hamas fighters.
Of Hamas fighters.
Hamas fighters. They are not militants.
Hamas militants.
They while fighting Hamas militants.
The militants. Several thousand Hamas militants.
And I'm looking right at the camera. They are terrorists. It is a barbarian who rapes and brutalizes women.
And what we're seeing today are very deadly consequences of failed policies, failure on the American administration's part to change course, failure on Israel's part.
Who kills children in front of their parents.
And this is a very, very big gift for Benjamin Netanyahu.
And then brings them over to Gaza. who literally, we've heard all these reports, and we know these aren't just reports. These were filmed.
This is just the beginning in terms of the retaliation for Gaza.
Now, I would have added, there were most of the television footage that we're seeing is just like bombs flying in the night of this, or it's soldiers saying, this is what I saw. And I've wondered, there are a couple of clips that we've seen that are not gruesome, but that were recorded by Hamas that do bring home what these guys are doing. One was of a little boy being bullied, and he's just standing there being pushed around by Hamas. And the other was of a family being taken hostage with two kids, that they are hostage, with two kids saying they saw their third sibling be murdered. And there's no blood or gore in these. And I've wondered, and had I been in Greenblatt's place, tell them, you guys need to be showing this stuff. This is what's happening. And I do think the footage of just bombs flying in the night, it's reminiscent of previous conflicts. And I think that the network should be showing this footage that shows this is different. This is what these people are doing. I understand, like the networks wouldn't air people jumping out, and they won't air the Twin
Once
Towers falling or people jumping out of the buildings. They have policies, but there's plenty of stuff they can air that I think gets at this that they aren't airing. So I would have gone beyond Greenblatt.
TV is hard on this because in print digital media, you can put a graphic or disturbing image and it stays there, and people can go back and look at it if they want to, but they see it. It has its power. On TV, especially 24-hour TV, how often do you keep showing? I agree with you that images of the night sky with flashes in it and the sound of explosions, or the aerial footage provided by the IDF doesn't bring home the same thing. But figuring out how often and how much to show this, the really disturbing images that you see, even when they're not gory, the really disturbing and unsettling images is hard. And it's hard to find that balance. But I agree with you that they need to be shown, and people have to understand what they're dealing with, not a sanitized remote control warfare.
And it brings to mind, President Biden in his remarks yesterday compared Hamas to ISIS, and it was the beheadings that brought home to the American people the nature of that enemy. And I think in the same way, when people see this, it does have a real impact. And by the way, Hamas wanted people to see this. They're proud of it.
Yeah, that's right.
And you look, we said, there's unity in this country, this, that, and the other, but there are lawmakers who are cheering this on, a handful of them. And I think it's useful seeing these images to see exactly what they're defending. The other piece that struck me as bizarre and indefensible was the main piece when you went to the Politico website on Monday morning was an interview with Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, who has been one of Hamas's chief apologists for the past 10 years. And the headline was, "We've been shaken out of this fantasy, how the left sees the war in Israel." I thought it was incredibly strange to have this be your main news piece. There was absolutely no pushback on anything he said, and this was one exchange. Alex Burns interviewed Matt Duss, the former Sanders foreign policy advisor. Burns says, "You just mentioned the painful reality check on the way the foreign policy establishment tends to think about the Palestinian issue. Do you think there's a larger credibility issue at stake here for what's considered establishment foreign policy thinking? The notion that the last few years have been movement in the direction of stability and, in terms of American interest, progress in the neighborhood?" And Duss responds, "It has destroyed this whole premise that we can just bottle up the Palestinians and it won't matter. It has destroyed the premise once again, and it's not the first time that we've been shaken out of this fantasy that we can invest in repression. We can invest in relationships with governments that imprison their own people and deliver security and stability. It may work for a little while, but it will not work forever, and when it erupts, it's extremely dangerous and tragic."
When I saw that quote in the headline, I assumed that the fantasy that they had been shaken out of was that Hamas could be a partner in peace.
No.
Oh.
And this is what we've seen here.
Wow.
And there's no pushback at any point in the interview. And
Woof.
I thought it was shameful and strange.
That is super lame. Wow. Geez Louise. What I have been meditating on in this stuff is stories like this that break through the normal barriers, and we saw the same thing with Ukraine. Stories that break through the normal barriers, the bubbles that people erect around themselves politically, often reveal how isolated people have become in their thinking, right? So for most Americans, they don't think about Israel and Palestine, and they don't think about that. They don't think about Palestinians and Israelis on a day-to-day basis. For most of the 330 million plus Americans, it's just not part of what they're thinking about, and it's not part of the news most days. And then when something like this happens, as folks who are normally consuming local news, let's talk about viewers, people who consume local news, maybe some news online, aren't engaged that much in day-to-day political or national news. When something like this breaks through, their reaction is going to be obvious. Who are these insane people? Who are these devils who are killing young people at a festival, who are kidnapping people's grandmothers, who are beheading children? Who are these people? This is outrageous. But if you live in a bubble like those kids at Harvard who put out their statements condemning Israel for being attacked, basically. If you live in the bubble that this person, what's his name, Matt Duss, if you live in a news bubble where you're only getting reinforced and you don't know how other people think, you are not going to be able to see the forest for the trees. You're not. So I'm always making the case for diversifying your news inputs and hearing other voices and expanding your horizons. Here's a great example of how stupid it can make you if you don't broaden your horizons.
Just so that lest our listeners think our criticism is limited to the left, I have to say that nothing outraged me so much this week than Tucker Carlson's interview with Vivek Ramaswamy, which I sent it to a few people, and they said, I started watching this but couldn't get to the end. I watched the whole thing, and I wanted to play a couple of clips from that. Let's take a listen.
I got to say, you mentioned moral outrage, and I thought the videos from southern Israel were morally outrageous, and I was offended by them and saddened by them. Anyone who saw them, I think, was. But you don't have to look far in the United States for moral outrages also on video. And there's not a city in this country, not just the big cities, but cities of 10,000 people. I was in one yesterday, that doesn't have some constellation of drug-addicted young people living outside. We call them the homeless. They're drug addicts. And they're addicted to drugs that were imported across an open border, allowed by the Biden administration, and they're dying, more than 100,000 a year. Now, you could call it genocide, you can call it whatever you want, but it's the death of over 100,000 Americans a year and the living death of millions more who are living outside. So I don't understand. People are outraged by what happened in Israel, and again, I want to add my voice to that because I'm a human being.
If I can just say, from a politics standpoint, this is why Vivek Ramaswamy is heading out. This is why he's going down, because again, of media bubbles and media echo chambers. When you live in this very online space and you hear only reinforcing things, you think that this is the time to say, well, it's opioids. What about opioids? It's so goofy and it's so disconnected, and it's
to draw an equivalence between what Israel is facing, the attempted genocide happening in the Middle East, and opioid overdoses that people are inflicting on themselves is so morally disgusting and backward. It is revealing about these people. It is revealing about a trend in the Republican Party. We know it's in the Democratic Party. We've seen the responses from Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. They have elected members of Congress. It exists in the Republican Party too. And I hope and expect this to come up in the next Republican presidential debate, and hope it is a rising matter of public attention and concern that these are loud voices in our politics.
Opinions, as I always say, are luxury items. Don't have more than you can afford. And one of the tendencies that we have with our opinions is that when we have our opinions, whatever events transpire, we want to shoehorn them into that. Just take it as it comes.
This is a deliberate minimization of an attempted wiping out of the Jewish people and the only Jewish state.
Yeah.
Chris, you sent this a little bit of a lighter item, and it's funny when I've some of my colleagues, when I've said, "Oh, like, can I make a joke or can I pass on gossip?" They've said, "Please, we need some lighter stuff." So we're going to move into that.
So Jeff Maurer, who has the I Might Be Wrong Substack and podcast,
you should be his mascot.
Well, he can be very, very good, and this is a really good format for him. And he wrote this parodic advice for how to take advantage to your political benefit. A headline: How to use the massacre in Israel to your political advantage. What's in this for you? All caps ? And he goes through and finds people like Jennifer Rubin, finds Ronna Romney McDaniel, finds Cori Bush, finds a bunch of people left and right. So here's tip 4. Use faint or even non-existent connections to tie noxious idiots to the political party you oppose. Useful for partisan hacks, media arms for partisan hacks. And talks here about how the backlash and the frontlash and how at each turn people in the media and politics are trying to exploit this for their advantage. Here's his conclusion. Of course, pretending that the fringiest freak you can find represents the beating heart of your political opposition is a tried and true political tactic. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict attracts extremists, so chances to tie your opponents to some frothing at the mouth mutant should abound. It should be, in the words of one notable hack, a great opportunity. And I really appreciated this because he used his effective lens at finding the people who were on the grind, trying to make the most of this moment for themselves rather than reacting to it like a human being.
Chris,
one of those.
This was amusing.
Well, to set it up, one of those people was Tim Scott, who has his presidential campaign went from full of potential to stalled to now hacky. And there were troubling signs for him of his hackiness we talked about here last week, going after Nikki Haley for the draperies when she was the ambassador to the United Nations, and that component from their debate. He has looking for a way to revitalize his campaign, has decided that he will take a backseat to nobody in blaming Joe Biden, and his refrain about Joe Biden is that Joe Biden has blood on his hands. Now, look, there's a lot of things that Republicans are going to say about Joe Biden in this, and about the billions of dollars that were unfrozen and made available, and about all the things that we just discussed with the loosening of the sanctions, and all fair comment. But Joe Biden doesn't have blood on his hands. He didn't murder anybody. He didn't want anybody to be murdered. And this was sort of this was another signpost on the road to what's happening to Tim Scott as he tries to run for president. And George Will
this should have been my favorite item.
So George Will has a column in the Washington Post, headline: Tim Scott, please drop out and urge others to follow and unite behind Haley. And as we have talked about, Haley and Scott occupy the same space in the Republican electorate, not just because they're both from the same early primary state, but they're going for the same traditional conservative Republican voters. They're also competing against each other in Iowa. And there is a pairing there that that will be resolved at some point to the benefit of one or the other.
And there is a real look. under no illusion that I don't live in an establishment bubble, but there is a real sense of urgency that the Republican field needs to shrink, and that there needs to be one option and make this a Trump or non-Trump race.
Yeah.
And everybody I talk to is just wants to see people start dropping out of this race.
Well, and right now Nikki Haley has momentum, right? Right now Nikki and the events of last week and the ongoing war help Nikki Haley, her standing in the eyes of Republicans. When foreign policy is important, having foreign policy experience becomes a good thing. And it is a good coincidence for Haley that it occurs as she has been moving forward, especially in New Hampshire, taking big vote share away from Ron DeSantis and Chris Christie and moving up and trying to get into second place there. And the pressure on Scott becomes very explicit from George Will, who says there is national incredulity, exhaustion, embarrassment, disgust, and fatalism about the political party's inability to generate palatable presidential choices. Word. Tim Scott could alter this with a trifecta of statesmanlike acts: withdrawing from the competition for the Republican presidential nomination, challenging others to do likewise, and exhorting them to join him in supporting Nikki Haley. And Will makes a potent argument why this would be correct for Tim Scott to do, that the conservative cause that Will holds so dear would be well served by it, and I think makes a pretty convincing argument. But the best part, maybe, is the
definitely
is the disclosure that is appended, or I guess appears before the piece. So George Will's wife is a political consultant, and she has worked for other people before. And so George Will, over the years, has had to put a disclaimer, a disclosure in his columns when his wife is working for somebody else. But go ahead and read this one. This is a different one.
The disclosure is: the columnist's wife, Mari Will, an advisor to Republican presidential candidate Senator Tim Scott, South Carolina, disagrees with this column. Chef's kiss.
That's well done, Mr. Will.
Chef's kiss.
Well done, Mr. and Mrs. Will.
Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about the coverage of the speaker race? I admit I have not been following this at all because I have only been following Israel coverage, but and I'll hand it over to you. But my only thought about this, and the Beacon has covered this race from this angle, is it does show you it would be good to have a functioning House of Speaker of the House and a functioning House of Representatives right now.
Yeah.
And there are real costs to what the renegade Republicans, along with all of the House Democrats, did. All of these people claim to support Israel, which days after they booted Kevin McCarthy went into an existential crisis. And there are House members upping bills right now that cannot get passed. And there are costs to this.
So Nancy Mace, who is now evidently just a goofball, who is not previously was goofball
These
adjacent.
These people are unserious.
So she wore a Scarlet A, which is in for adultery in the Scarlet Letter. She wore the Scarlet Letter A drawn on a camisole to go to the House of Representatives, because she says she's wearing the Scarlet Letter because as a woman, she dared stand up to the political establishment, which of course is convenient because we now no longer have to ever think about Nancy Mace as a serious person ever again. We're off the hook when it comes to considering Nancy Mace. But how do you think Nancy Mace would have voted if the speaker, if the motion to vacate the chair was happening this week as opposed to before Hamas attacked?
Exactly.
And
Matt Gaetz wants to run for governor of Florida.
Right.
I hear there are a lot of Jews there.
And the idea that the unseriousness of the fight within the Republican Party is, of course, made manifest by and here's another thought experiment. Not only do I think that Kevin McCarthy would have not been evicted, or that the vote might not even have been held if it were now, right? Think about what coverage. So we're recording this as the House Republicans are convening. They have convened. Nate Moore will be monitoring. And by the way, it's sweater season. Colin Chicola is here in a sweater. Nate Moore's still rocking linen. Still, it's a light twill. It's a heathered twill. It's a light twill. Autumn is here and Nate Moore is behind. Well, he's in cords, but I feel like Colin's more fall forward.
And you didn't even mention me in my vest.
I like your vest. I think you look like you're about to walk across the quad to go. You look like you're about to walk across.
Channeling youth.
Just walk across the quad to go in and go in.
Meet with the prof.
To meet with the prof for office hours and have a matcha latte. So the Dispatch, I will say, does a really good job of this. Walking and chewing gum at the same time, covering these things. But how would coverage of today's speaker vote in behind closed doors among Republicans be different today if it were not for the conflict in the Middle East, if it were not for this war? This would be
wall to wall.
Wall to wall. And Matt Gaetz would be getting everything that he wanted, every whisper, every utterance. What's the latest from Matt Gaetz? And all of that stuff. But because of the war, it's happening basically in a vacuum. And again, I do want to praise the Dispatch politics team for keeping us abreast of it and doing it with a 30,000-foot view that has been very useful. But I also want to praise today something I did not think that I would be saying. Punchbowl News, which is too insidery generally to be useful to me. And what they're selling is for lobbyists and staff and people in Congress to really obsess over. But man, as I was trying to wrap my head around how this vote was going to be, Punchbowl News broke it down in a way that Axios could only dream of. It was so useful for me to see how it goes, and I was reminded of having multiple sources from multiple occasions. Sometimes you want to dive deep, and Punchbowl did a really good job about explaining how, and this is, as Jonah would say, complicated without the benefit of being interesting. There's a vote before the vote that's going to take place that I was struggling to understand how it would go, and they laid it out, and it was really useful. So thank you, Punchbowl News.
Who is your money on?
I mean, if I had $100 to bet, I'd put $80 on Steve Scalise. Colin will cut that out if he fails. I just think it will be very hard for Jim Jordan to get there because Republicans know what a horror show the stretch between here and the election would be for them, because Jordan is totally undisciplined. He has been really good at sucking up to Kevin McCarthy and leadership to try to get to where he is. But you can imagine how many shutdowns, you can imagine how much crazy stuff, and you can also imagine the Hunter Biden the absolute fixation on Hunter Biden that would overtake the House at a moment where House Republicans are very eager to demonstrate that they have the capacity to govern.
Let me ask the following.
Yes.
Is there any chance that some establishment folks get behind Scalise or get behind Jordan because it would be more difficult to portray him as an establishment tool, and they would have more stable leadership for a longer time?
I think persuadable. Well, it depends on what you want. If the worse the better is the idea that you make it so bad that ultimately the Republican Party kicks out the kooks and their status inside the conference is reduced.
And Jordan's done an interesting two-step over the past few years. I mean, he became a real McCarthy ally.
Yeah, totally. The sucking up was real. I think that and it will depend on this vote, whether they have to get to 217 votes inside the conference or whether they can do what they used to do, which is if you get a majority of the conference, then you take it to the floor. Chip Roy and Brian Fitzpatrick, a moderate Republican, both say, no, we have to finish this inside. And we'll report back next week on how that all went. But I just think that if it's not Scalise, Elise Stefanik is somebody who makes sense because she is from the establishment but has spent a lot of time sucking up to the nationalists. And there are more mainstream Republicans than there are nationalists or MAGA Republicans. So she's one. But they could also exhaust themselves, right? If they can't get there, they may end up. Matt Gaetz may end up with getting a caretaker speaker of the Denny Hastert mold rather than a more nationalistic or MAGA speaker that he said he wanted, because they may exhaust themselves in conference, and eventually somebody like Tom Cole from Oklahoma, or somebody who people could say, look, let's just be done here and move on. I think that's true. But Scalise, as much as Team McCarthy may sort of rue the fact that Scalise will finally inherit what he's been angling for so long, sometimes to the detriment of Kevin McCarthy, I think that looks still like the most likely thing by a pretty wide margin.
Chris, that leads us to our quick report on the news business.
Yeah, what happened?
Which is that the Washington Post is slashing its staff. They are planning to lay off about 240 people, and I believe that's of about 1,500 reporters. And they had a $100 million loss. And my takeaway from this is that, I mean, even Jeff Bezos can't make money in the news business.
Yeah, but quit trying. Just spend it, baby. It feels so good.
Exactly. So we have that. And then our style and food sections.
Yes.
We each have an item.
Yes.
Chris.
This is I shouldn't pick on these kinds of lists, and I shouldn't pick on Orlando. I shouldn't. Orlando, the Indianapolis of Florida. I should not do that. And yet, because I saw this cited and posted, and so here's what lists and stories like these are catnip for social media, for mentioning in your story and trying to push out for social media hits. The best foodie cities in America 2023. And this is from Wallet Hub. And I don't know what Wallet Hub is, but I see Wallet Hub cited constantly. Wallet Hub may be a family of raccoons living under a porch somewhere with AI. I don't know what Wallet Hub is, but it gets cited a lot as if it was a thing. And here's... So they did their list, and we've done lists like this before. We've talked about lists like this before of, and this is not the excellent kind of reporting that the New York Times did on hot dog, on the hot dogs of America, but instead the best state for this or the best state for that or whatever. And here it is, the best food cities, the best food cities in America. Orlando, Florida. Portland, Oregon, I mean, whatever. Sacramento, California, absolutely not. Sacramento, California is absolutely not the third best food city in America. Miami, Florida, yes. San Francisco, yes. Tampa, no. There's good food to be had in Tampa, but Tampa's not a better food city than Washington, D.C. It's not a better food city than Boston. It's not a better food city than New Orleans, Louisiana. And it is most assuredly not a better food city than New York. New York is the best food city in the country because it has so many people and it has so many rich people and it has so much of everything. And so I would just tell everyone, when you see a list that includes San Diego, California, as the 7th best food city in New York, and that it is ahead of, and I like San Diego, but when San Diego is 10 spots better than Washington, D.C., here's a clue that you may be dealing with a flawed list.
Mine is, I watched The Golden Bachelor.
Oh,
and
no.
I am here to report back. All right, this was my last night of leisure because it was Friday night and this war broke out Saturday. And my husband was in Las Vegas partying his tushy off. Yes, he went to some football game. I don't know. My husband was in Las Vegas.
No, the Raiders,
some college football game.
In Las Vegas.
Well, let me ask him and report back.
Patrick, I'm sorry if I'm getting you in trouble here.
Yeah, I also asked him, like, did you hit up any strip clubs?
Whoa.
What did you do? So
College football
okay,
in
I
Las
just asked
Vegas.
him. I'll report back.
Okay. The UNLV running Rebels.
I'm just going to say reporting on the podcast. The listeners want to know.
Maybe he went to watch one. Maybe the idea was that he and his friends.
They definitely did that.
Maybe he and his friends wanted to watch it.
By the way,
at the
I
sports
did
book.
this with him for the NCAA Final Four.
Okay.
Or we did Sweet 16, and it was so much fun.
I mean,
We
Vegas.
had such a blast.
I mean, it's not as good of a food city as Orlando, but Vegas does have some good places to go.
Yes. So, Friday night, Home Alone, watched The Golden Bachelor. It is great.
No,
it is great.
It's bad.
The guy is a total dork. He's really good looking, but a total dork.
He's from where? He's from Iowa, India.
He's from
Indiana.
he's from the
Colin.
Midwest. And then
Colin is like in.
Oh, didn't go to a game.
Okay.
His report is didn't go to a game, just watched and gambled on them at a casino Saturday and Sunday.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right.
So, Golden Bachelor, it's enjoyable.
This is just for context,
he seems like
America.
a decent human
just
being.
for context,
he's
America.
a widower.
This is a decent
and there's
human
lots
being.
of widows on the show.
This is a
and
decent
it's
human
cute.
being. This is a decent human being who, at age 71 or whatever, agreed to be tested for sexually transmitted diseases so that he could appear on a television show.
And can I just?
I don't know. I don't know.
Can I just jump ahead to a piece of reader mail?
Yes.
Reader mail from Christian Costa.
Oh,
who
yes,
writes,
my friend.
Hey, Wretches.
Yes, she's so
Christian
great.
Costa here from over the pond in London. I had the pleasure of working with Chris at Fox, and I very rarely disagree with his commentary on just about any matter. But I have to say he is absolutely wrong about The Golden Bachelor. I watched the first 2 episodes, and that's what I watched. I watched the first 2 episodes this weekend, and I loved it. To see people want to fall in love again in their 60s and 70s is so fun. To see women aging gracefully, remaining confident, and supporting each other is good content we could all use.
Christian.
I hope Aliana agrees, and while I doubt he has time or interest, I wish Chris would give it a try. I look forward to listening to both of you each week. You really do make the news fun and interesting, where it could otherwise feel very dark and overwhelming. You should both feel so proud of the work you do. Wretch on.
Christian Costa. That is not aging gracefully, and I love Christian. She is just a peach, and she was so helpful to me at Fox, and she is a very promising and enterprising young woman who will make a great success of herself. But I will tell you this: aging gracefully does not involve what these women are doing. Gracefully is not the term. But I want you to know, the boys and I were at dinner last night at just a neighborhood place. And there was an older couple, and by older, I mean older than me. There was an older couple there on what was pretty obviously a first date. And they were tanned. Their faces were firm, I'll say, and they were wearing expensive athleisure attire, right? So I would guess that these were people maybe, I'll say 60 or so. And they were dressed for sports, but very clearly not going to participate in sports. And they were very fit and well put together, and they were clearly on a first date or a very, very early days of the date. And you know what I did? I picked up their check.
That is so lovely.
Because it takes courage to go do that. And I'm for them. I didn't tell them I was going to pick up their check, and I did so anonymously. But I think it takes courage to go out and do it. But again,
Anonymous no more if they're listeners of this podcast.
they didn't look like they were probably Ink Stain Wretches listeners. I would say fitness and golf. Maybe they're probably listening to a pickleball podcast right now, and we wish them well. But that is one thing, and I'm all for it. Looking for love in all the right places on the patio at Mama's Kitchen. But it is not graceful if the participants must be tested for sexually transmitted diseases before undertaking any encounter. This is not the sign of graceful aging.
All right, Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week, where we break down the stories we can't get out of our heads. And in the interest of time, and because my obsession was the war, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we will move on to favorite items.
Well, my obsession is and I will not belabor it because I wrote a whole column about it, which we will link in the show notes so that you can read it. But I think everybody has now heard of Deaths of Despair and the research done by a pair of Princeton, researchers who were the ones in a 2015 paper identified that the lowered life expectancy for basically middle-age, middle-class white dudes. And this was there was a unified field theory here in which this explained Donald Trump. And in my research looking at how this had been tied to these discussions, the Washington Post, with characteristic restraint in talking about these matters, had a headline that was something like "How Deaths Predict Where People Will Vote for Donald Trump." And so this was the idea was, and it was very much like the 1960s, poor whites, we feel bad for them, but they're a big problem. Right, because in those days it was that they weren't supporting racial integration and they weren't supporting the end of the Vietnam War. This time it's they're backing Donald Trump and they're against progressive goals. So the work of Case and Deaton, it's a husband and wife pair at Princeton, was useful for a period of time in helping us understand how bad the opioid crisis really was. It was really helpful to see how hard it had hit. But as they have continued to try to extrapolate these views out into policy solutions, right? Because nobody wants to be the one who says, wow, look at this amazingly sad thing. See you later. If you're an academic, if you're a policy person, you want a policy that will do it. And they're out with a new report. And it was basically, it's right, but it's just wrong. Because what they're saying is, oh, look, it's the divide at college. The real difference here is college. And if the people who don't go to college are dying so much sooner, and it fetishizes college, and it makes it seem like college is this vehicle out of these problems. Solid standing in the upper middle class of the United States is a great place to be. Being from a family, living in a household with a solidly upper middle class, if you're in the third quintile and above, is a great place to be in the world. And below that, it's really tough. It can get really, really tough. And college can, for individual people, college can be a vehicle to great success. And I know a lot of people who were first generation in their family to go to college. They took advantage of the many pathways that we have to college in the United States, and it was a great story for them. But generally speaking, what a college education is, and I think I could sum this all up by saying, read Charles Murray's Coming Apart. Right?
It's a wonderful book.
Just read Charles Murray's Coming Apart. If you want to, and he wrote that before Case and Deaton's work came out. He did this way before Donald Trump. He did this way before whatever. Read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, because he looks at white America 1960 to 2010, and he talks about what happened. And college is a big part of what happened, because it wasn't that college changed the people. It was that college sorted the people. And that the people stopped. My parents were very typical of America at one point. My dad had a college degree. My mom did not. That was not a very uncommon. They got married in the late 1950s. That was not an uncommon thing at all in the late 1950s, especially for men to have gone to college and women not to have gone to college. That was very normal. It doesn't happen anymore, right? People who go to college marry other people who go to college, and the coming apart, the pulling apart of elite Americans into their special class and the resulting carnage there.
And women going to work.
Yes.
Which means the pairing up of professional women and professional men and the sorting of that.
Yes. And this massive pulling apart. College had the increase in college going rate, and a majority of Americans still are not college diplomats and diplomates. And the majority of Americans, this will change over the next decade or so with the baby boomers passing on. But this is still mostly a not college country. But the elite is uniformly college, right? Almost uniformly college. And that top 20% is pulling itself further away from the 80%. And the consequences, as you allude to, are really dire for the 80%.
And the college leads to different sorts of sorting. It leads to having kids later, living in different cities, doing different professions, making more money, and leads to people leading completely different lifestyles, living in different cultures, having different values.
Yes.
And essentially, the book is about the creation of two different countries within one country.
And it was all there. And to watch this effort that is finally, and it got so close. There was a Yasha Monk piece, and they were so close. They were right on the 3-yard line, but they couldn't get to the final thing, which is college has changed the way Americans live. It's not about how they learn or what skills you get or what happens to you at college. It is that it has fundamentally reshaped American cultural life. And the people who go to college manage to maintain the kind of value, typically, America's elites. And this is David Brooks's work in Bobo's in Paradise, too. And so it made me mad, so I wrote a whole thing about it. And now I'll inflict it on you, America.
And I did want to note that we had a very thoughtful letter that we will read next week from Paul R. in Idaho.
We hear you, Paul.
Yes, we will get to it next week. But now it is time for your favorite time of the week, where I am forced to say something nice, but you will lead by example.
I have one son who loves sports, who is a sporto to the core. He can tell you all of the batting statistics, he can give you the odds for every game. He lives there. And I have another son who couldn't have he could not have cared less about sports, but has for some reason come to embrace I guess this is correct for him, Bundesliga soccer and Formula One racing. So it is to my eldest man-child that I owe thanks for this piece on Yuki Tsunoda. Okay, sorry, Mr. Tsunoda, which was this really interesting look into Formula racing and really interesting look into this guy who's like the bad boy, and he's defying the stereotypes about polite, nice Japanese people by being rude, crude, vulgar, and all this stuff. And it turns out it's really well written and really engaging. And
well, can you read the quote from him? It's so funny.
Oh, yes. Okay. The pressure was on. Let's see.
I'll read it.
Okay, you go ahead.
In the wildly popular Netflix series Formula One Drive to Survive, Mr. Tsunoda was shown farting, being lackadaisical about strength training, and announcing, "I want to go first poo before a massage." So I'm tuning in. Golden Bachelor, you're going to have to take a back seat.
That's right. I dig it.
I mentioned this last week, but I wanted to give a plug to Robert Novak's book, Prince of Darkness,
so good.
Which I have been reading. It is fantastic. And it brings home, Robert Novak wrote an opinion column, a reported opinion column for several decades. And it really underscores how important reporting is as a foundation of writing opinion, and how important talking to people, traveling, getting out, and informing yourself is, because I meet so many young people who want to sit behind their computer screens and write opinion.
Get out of your bubble.
And you really, really see in this memoir how well he knew politicians. He traveled to Vietnam to see the war and talk to the American officials who were running the war. And at the beginning, he writes, "For the sober-sided younger generations of journalists, having fun may seem unserious. But I had a terrific time fulfilling all my youthful dreams and at the same time making life miserable for hypocritical, posturing politicians, and I hope performing a service for my country."
Yay!
So thought that was a wonderful note to end on.
Break out of your bubble, people.
That is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a 5-star review.
6.
Just search for Wretches.